Okay, so there's a ton of advice out there, right?
Yeah.
About like how to live a good life. But I bet you haven't thought about taking advice from a 16th century essayist.
Oh, I don't know. Some of those guys were pretty sharp.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We're talking Michel de Montaigne. And he wasn't about, giving you a 10-step plan to happiness. He was more about uh, grappling with the big question, how to live.
A question we're all still asking centuries later.
Totally. And to help us with this deep dive, we're looking at Sarah Bakewell's book, How to Live, or A Life of Montaigne in One Question and 20 Attempts at an Answer.
Yeah, Bakewell's book is really great. It takes this massive, sprawling work of Montaigne's and gives us a framework for understanding it. She breaks down his ideas into these 20 different approaches to the question of how to live, which, for someone trying to wrap their head around Montaigne, it's a really helpful structure.
It's perfect for our listeners, people who want to get to the heart of things, not just skim the surface. And what I think is so fascinating about Montaigne, especially for people who value intellectual honesty, is that his essays aren't like this definitive statement of truth.
Right.
They're more like this ongoing self-portrait, this constantly evolving exploration of his own thoughts and experiences.
Exactly. He was really trying to understand himself.
Yeah.
And in that process, he stumbled upon these incredible insights about what it means to be human. It's almost like he's thinking out loud, right? Wrestling with these big questions in real time.
I love that. So
Yeah.
instead of thinking of him as some kind of guru with all the answers, think of him more as a fellow traveler, someone who's on the same journey as you, figuring things out as he goes along. And the real value isn't necessarily in the answers he comes up with, but in the process itself, the honesty, the rigor of his questioning. That's where the real gold is.
Yeah, I mean, what Montaigne was doing with his essays was pretty unique. He called it the only book in the world of its kind. He even said it had a wild and eccentric plan.
Or sometimes no plan at all.
Haha, right. Exactly. It wasn't this systematic treatise. It was more organic. He kept adding to it, revising it over decades from, 1572 until he died in 1592.
Wow.
It grew like a coral reef, layer upon layer of thought. And even today, you can read his work and come away with a totally different understanding depending on your own experiences and the context of your own life.
It's like that Project Bakewell talks about, the Oxford News, where people share these little self-portraits.
Yes.
It shows this deep human desire to understand ourselves, right?
Yeah.
To connect with others who are also trying to figure things out.
Absolutely. And Bakewell gives us a really important piece of advice when it comes to reading Montaigne. She says, don't read him as children do for amusement, nor as the ambitious do to be instructed. No, read him in order to live.
I love that.
And her book takes that advice to heart. She uses this Renaissance question of how to live as a kind of guide, a way to navigate the richness and sometimes the contradictions in Montaigne's thinking. Each chapter of her book looks at a different aspect of this question, reflecting the many ways Montaigne himself approached it. And he rarely settles on easy answers. He throws out anecdotes, observations, more questions, which, can be frustrating if you're looking for a simple solution.
Right. But that's not what Montaigne's about.
Exactly.
So let's dig into one of his more interesting attempts at answering this question. Be born.
Ah, yes.
Which brings us to Montaigne's rather unusual childhood. He was actually sent to live with a peasant family for the first few years of his life. And then, get this, he was raised speaking Latin as his first language. French was like a secondary language for him.
Wild.
Can you imagine? I mean, what kind of impact does something like that have on your development, on your way of thinking?
Well, it speaks volumes about his father, Pierre Acom. He was a real forward-thinking guy, huge fan of the humanist Erasmus.
Okay.
And he really wanted to create this unique educational experience for Montaigne. He wanted him to be fluent in the language of scholarship, to be able to engage with classical ideas directly. And Montaigne talks about his father as this, very competent manager of their estate, a man of action.
Interesting.
Which is pretty funny because Montaigne describes himself as, kind of lazy. Admits he doesn't really care much for practical matters.
So it makes you wonder, right? How much of our intellectual path is shaped by maybe even rebelling against our parents' expectations?
A good question.
Bakewell points out that Montaigne often praises his father, but then immediately turns around and emphasizes how different he is.
Right.
Even when he talks about managing the family estate, he kind of frames it as like he's doing it to honor his father's memory, not because it's something he's passionate about.
That's a really interesting point. It's like he's defining himself in contrast to his father.
Exactly. So for our listeners, I think there's a real lesson here about how our family dynamics shape us and how sometimes, we figure out who we are by pushing back against what's expected of us.
For sure. And, even though Montaigne's father wanted him to have this easy, natural education, by raising him speaking Latin, he kind of set him apart
Oh, yeah?
from his family, from his
Like
culture.
an outsider.
Yeah, which on the one hand probably fostered this incredible independence of mind, but it could also have led to a sense of attachment. He was steeped in the world of ancient thinkers from a very young age, which is amazing. But it might have also made it hard for him to connect with the everyday concerns of his peers.
Now, this next part, I think, is what really speaks to a curious mind. Montaigne's views on learning and his embrace of skepticism. He believed that true knowledge comes from all sorts of experiences, not just from books.
Right, not just formal education.
Yeah. He said, a page's prank, a servant's blunder, a remark at table. All of that contributes to our understanding of the world.
Mm.
And he was a huge advocate for questioning everything
Yes, pass everything through a sieve, he said.
and lodge nothing in his head on mere authority and trust.
Exactly.
I mean, that's got to resonate with our listeners, right?
Yeah.
People who value critical thinking, evidence-based reasoning.
Absolutely. And this leads us to Montaigne's fascination with Pyrrhonian skepticism.
Skepticism.
Yeah, it's an ancient school of thought that basically said we can't know anything for sure.
Wow. Okay.
The key concept is epoch, which means I suspend judgment.
Okay.
It's not about being completely doubtful about everything. It's more about having the discipline to say, I don't know, when you're faced with uncertainty. Montaigne even had medals made with the word epocho on them, with images of scales.
Wow.
A reminder to weigh the evidence, not just blindly accept things at face value, which in today's world where we're bombarded with information all the time is pretty relevant. So important. And he didn't just apply this skepticism to the outside world. He turned it inward. He constantly questioned his own perceptions, his own judgments. He admitted he was fallible, that he could be wrong.
Even the original Pyrrhonian skeptics didn't necessarily go that far,
Yeah.
but Montaigne made self-examination a central part of his project.
What do you think we can learn from that? From his willingness to doubt himself?
It's a sign of real intellectual integrity, isn't it? A willingness to confront your own limitations, your own biases.
To not take yourself too seriously.
Exactly. And by writing his essays, he basically turned himself into a research subject. He observed his own reactions, his inconsistencies, how he changed over time. He even found a weird kind of pleasure in the fact that his memory was fading
Really?
because it reminded him that he wasn't perfect, that he wasn't all-knowing.
Let's talk about Montaigne's friendship with Etienne de la Boétie.
Oh, yes.
Bakewell describes it as this incredibly intense bond, like a complete mingling of souls.
It was a remarkable friendship, really remarkable. What was it about their connection that was so powerful for Montaigne?
They were just completely in sync, intellectually, emotionally. Montaigne describes it as this total unity, this feeling of losing himself in the other person. Now, talking about male friendship in these terms was somewhat common in the Renaissance.
Okay.
But the intensity of their connection was clearly something special. They shared this deep love of learning, this commitment to figuring out how to live well, and they clicked on a level that most people never experience. It shows you the profound impact that a true kindred spirit can have on your life.
But then La Boétie dies,
Mhm.
way too young. And Bakewell really emphasizes how devastating this loss was for Montaigne.
Oh, absolutely.
It shaped his whole outlook on life, his writing. He dedicated himself to preserving his friend's memory. He even had an inscription put on the walls of his library in La Boétie's honor.
That's beautiful.
It was like this constant reminder of their bond. How did this loss affect Montaigne's writing?
Well, he channeled his grief into his work. He wanted to honor La Boétie's legacy. And he also took on the task of editing and publishing La Boétie's writing, including his discourse on voluntary servitude.
Good.
Now, that particular text was pretty politically charged. It was later adopted by radical Huguenots,
Oh, wow.
but La Boétie himself probably wouldn't have supported their cause. So Montaigne had to navigate this really delicate situation. He was loyal to his friend, but he also had to be aware of the political climate. And in the end, he actually removed a chapter from La Boétie's book that contained some controversial verses.
It's fascinating how personal relationships, political realities, and ideas all intersect.
It really is.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about Montaigne's engagement with the wider world. Bakewell portrays him as someone who was remarkably open, merciful and observant, even during a very tumultuous time in history.
He was a very unusual figure.
For instance, he kept his estate open to visitors, even though it was dangerous.
I know. What do you make of that?
It seems like he had this deep faith in human connection, and maybe a certain fearlessness that came from his intellectual honesty.
He did have this kind of radical trust in people.
Yeah, like he believed in the power of being open and vulnerable, even when it might have been wiser to be cautious.
Bakewell tells this great story about a group of soldiers who came to his estate. They were planning to basically take advantage of his hospitality.
Oh, no.
But then they met him face to face, and they were totally disarmed by his honesty and sincerity.
Wow.
It just goes to show you the power of authenticity.
And his views on mercy and cruelty were also really striking. He had such a strong sense of empathy, not just for other people, but for animals, too.
He was very sensitive to suffering.
And he was so insightful about human nature and the differences between cultures. Bakewell talks about his encounter with the Tupinamba people from Brazil.
Oh, yes.
He observed their customs and their perspective on the world. And he was really struck by their reaction to the inequality they saw in French society. They couldn't believe how differently people were treated.
It really made him question his own culture's values.
Yeah. He wasn't romanticizing the Tupinamba or anything. He was using their perspective as a way to challenge European assumptions of superiority.
It was a brilliant way to make people think critically about their own beliefs.
And it's so relevant today, right? When we're trying to understand different cultures and break down prejudices.
Absolutely.
Now, it's interesting to think about how different thinkers reacted to Montaigne's ideas. Bakewell talks about Descartes, who's all about finding certainty, and Pascal, who is deeply troubled by Montaigne's skepticism.
Yeah, those are two very different responses.
Why do you think their interpretations were so different?
Well, Descartes was trying to build a whole philosophical system based on absolute truth. So Montaigne's embrace of uncertainty was pretty much the opposite of what he was going for.
Okay.
And Pascal was a deeply religious thinker.
Right.
So for him, skepticism was kind of dangerous. He saw it as a threat to faith and morality.
They both represent these different ways of grappling with Montaigne's ideas, which are still so relevant today.
Yeah.
But then you have figures like Nietzsche, who was a huge admirer of Montaigne.
Oh, yeah, Nietzsche loved Montaigne. He called him the freest and mightiest of souls.
Oh.
And Virginia Woolf also appreciated Montaigne. She loved his ability to make you aware of your own fallibility.
That's a great point. He has this way of making you question yourself, your assumptions.
And he does it in a way that's not judgmental.
Exactly.
He's just inviting you to think more deeply.
I love that. Finally, let's talk about Montaigne's acceptance of an ordinary and imperfect life.
One of his most powerful ideas.
He famously wrote, "I set forth a humble and inglorious life." There's this sense of him letting go of the pursuit of some idealized version of himself and embracing the messiness of being human.
He was all about accepting reality as it is.
What's so wise about that? About accepting the ordinary?
I think it's incredibly freeing. Montaigne found a way to find meaning and even joy in the everyday. He even learned from his physical ailments. He had kidney stones, and he saw them as a reminder of his mortality.
Really?
Yeah. He wasn't trying to escape the human condition. He was trying to understand it, to embrace it.
What a powerful way to live. So to wrap up this deep dive, let's recap some of the key takeaways from Montaigne and Bakewell's book. We talked about the importance of self-reflection, of learning from all of our experiences, questioning everything, and embracing skepticism.
Right.
We talked about the profound impact of friendship and the importance of openness and empathy. And finally, we talked about accepting the beauty and wisdom of an ordinary life.
And I think it's worth emphasizing that Montaigne's work isn't about finding easy answers. It's about engaging in this lifelong process of questioning and understanding, which is something I know our listeners are all about.
Exactly. So as you go about your day, think about Montaigne's example. He spent his life trying to figure out how to live. What might you discover if you dedicate even a little bit of time to reflecting on your own life, your own experiences?
That's a great question.
And in a world that's obsessed with achieving extraordinary things, consider the power of embracing the ordinary. What if the real wisdom lies in finding beauty and meaning in the everyday moments of our lives?
I think Montaigne would say that's exactly where it lies.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder.
Until next time.
Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.